Story 2. The Locked Room Upstairs. My cousin inherited the cabin after our great-uncle passed away quietly, alone in that isolated stretch of forest where no one had bothered to look in for years. I'd heard stories of him, how he rarely came down to the valley, how he'd stay locked inside through long stretches of winter, and how he'd been found in that same cabin, sitting stiff and staring as though waiting for something, or someone, that would never come. When my cousin mentioned spending a weekend up there to clean and fix it, I agreed, thinking it would be a quiet retreat from everything, a way to escape the city for a few days. The cabin was small, worn, its wood grey with age, roof shingles curling like old leaves, but there was a charm to it, something honest and unpretentious, surrounded by dense pines that smelled of damp earth and spring rain. The air was heavy, a sort of stagnant sweetness mixed with the metallic tang of old tools and rusted nails, and I remember thinking that being there felt like stepping into someone else's memory. The first odd thing I noticed was the door to the upstairs. Solid oak, darkened by decades, the knob blackened with tarnish. We had no key that would turn it, no matter how hard we tried. My cousin shrugged it off, laughing nervously, claiming it was just one of those old locks that seized up after years of disuse. Still, there was something in the way the door sat in its frame, almost as if it were aware of our eyes on it, resisting us, daring us to try. The stairs leading up were narrow, and each step creaked with a complaint that felt almost like a whisper. That night, as we settled in the living room with lanterns and old blankets, I began to hear it, the faintest sound from above. Footsteps, soft, measured, pacing back and forth. I froze, heart skipping, but my cousin dismissed it as nothing more than the house settling, old boards shifting in the cool night air. I wanted to believe her, and for a while I did. The second night, the footsteps returned. I sat rigid, trying to convince myself it was just the wind rattling the roof, but the rhythm was deliberate, too even to be accidental. There was a cadence to it, the kind you notice when someone paces to count minutes or keep track of thoughts. Every once in a while I thought I heard a faint sigh, a soft exhalation that accompanied each step, like someone thinking out loud. My cousin slept soundly, snoring softly by the fire, oblivious. I stayed awake, holding a lantern in one hand, flashlight in the other, staring at the stairs, hoping to catch some explanation. Nothing came, only the relentless pacing above, measured and cold. On the third night, I woke to something entirely stranger. The air was thick and still, no wind outside, no creaks from the boards, but on the kitchen table lay a key. Small iron, blackened by age, shining faintly in the moonlight through the window. I know neither of us had placed it there. No one else had been in the house. My stomach twisted as I picked it up, weighing it in my palm, fingers trembling. Against every instinct, I walked to the stairs and slid the key into the lock. The knob turned easily, almost too easily, and I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty. Dust hung in the air like smoke, illuminated by the slanting moonlight. In the center of the room was a single chair, wooden and simple, facing the wall. I froze. The floor beneath it bore deep grooves, parallel scratches, as if the chair had been dragged back and forth countless times. Methodically, obsessively, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been my great-uncle, sitting there, obsessively rearranging the chair, pacing the room. But as I stood there, lantern casting narrow beams across the grooves, I realized I could still hear it, the pacing, and it wasn't coming from the floorboards or the walls. It was behind me. The sound was slow, deliberate, each step carrying weight even though I could see nothing. My mouth went dry. I wanted to turn, but my limbs refused. My ears strained, trying to place the rhythm, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. I wasn't. The pacing was real, close, deliberate and patient, as though whoever, or whatever, was up there had been waiting for me, counting on my curiosity. I finally forced myself to step backward, hand gripping the back of the chair for balance, lantern shaking in my fingers. The steps didn't falter, didn't speed up, didn't stop. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee down the stairs, into the forest, into anything but that room. But my eyes were drawn to the chair, to the grooves, to the way the shadows pooled in the corners. My great-uncle's presence, or the memory of it, was thick, palpable, as if the room itself held him still, pressing him into the walls, into the floor, into the air. I could feel it watching me, waiting for recognition, for acknowledgement, for fear. I stumbled toward the door, every nerve on fire, and as I opened it, the hall stretched before me, empty, silence, save for the ordinary creaks of an old house. I rushed downstairs, heart hammering, lungs burning, unable to look back. My cousin remained asleep, unaware, and I sat by the fire long after, listening, straining for any sign of the footsteps that had haunted the third floor. None came. Not then. Not for a long while. Only the heavy, musty smell of old wood and something metallic lingered in the air, a reminder that I had been somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The next day, we tried to go about ordinary work, sweeping the floors, fixing loose boards, dusting shelves. But every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing at the stairs, imagining the pacing beginning again, imagining the chair sliding slowly forward, dragging its grooves across the floor. I told my cousin nothing. Tried to laugh it off, but I knew she felt it too, the weight of that locked room, the memory of its occupant. At night, the pacing returned, slow, deliberate, exactly as before. The chair remained in the same position when I finally forced myself to glance upstairs. Grooves still marked the floor, and that whispering thought lingered in the corners of my mind, the notion that the room had been waiting all these years for someone to find it, someone to unlock the door, someone to notice that it was never empty. I left the cabin that weekend with more than just memories of dust and peeling paint. I left with the sound of measured steps echoing in my head, a presence I could not name, and the deep, unsettling knowledge that some spaces remember us long after we leave. Even now, years later, I hear the pacing in old houses, in attics when the wind presses against the eaves, and sometimes in the quiet moments before dawn. It's never loud, never violent, just deliberate, a reminder that some doors are better left locked, and some rooms are better left undisturbed. And still, in the back of my mind, I can feel those grooves leading back and forth, as if guiding anyone who dares to follow them to the same silent, watchful chair. Story 3. The Winter Guests. The first night at my uncle's hunting cabin was unsettling in ways I didn't anticipate. The snow had been falling steadily for days, piling thick against the windows, drifting in waves across the porch. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine, old wood, and the faint sharp tang of last year's fire that hadn't fully burned out. The wind pressed against the walls like a living thing, howling through the gaps in the logs, bending the trees outside until they scraped against one another with a sound that reminded me of voices, soft and desperate, echoing across the frozen woods. I told myself it was only the wind, that the forest always groaned this way in winter, and I tried to settle in for the night. The heater worked only sporadically, and the room chilled around me as I stacked firewood and wrapped myself in blankets, trying to convince myself I was alone and safe. By the second night, the unease had begun to settle into something thicker, almost tangible. I would wake at odd hours to the same sound, murmuring, faint but distinct, just beyond the frost-covered windows. At first, I thought it was the wind again, carrying voices like leaves across the snow. But there was a pattern, a rhythm to it, as if someone were standing outside just beyond the glass, speaking in low, careful tones I couldn't make out. I tried not to think about it too hard. I reminded myself that the cabin had always been isolated, miles from any road, and any wandering traveller in a blizzard would be long gone before nightfall. Yet the whispering persisted, soft enough that I could almost convince myself it was imagination, just long enough to send my mind spinning with doubts. By the third night, the voices became impossible to ignore. They weren't in the trees anymore. They were closer, pressing against the cabin itself. I woke with the sound just at my window, a faint rhythm of conversation, broken, almost like they were speaking to each other in low tones and pauses that I could almost recognize, but never fully understand. The snow had frozen into thick sheets against the glass, yet I could see the shadows moving faintly in the faint moonlight that filtered through the trees. I swallowed hard, heart hammering, and after what felt like hours finally worked up the courage to peer through the frost. The sight froze me where I stood. Several pairs of footprints had been carved into the snow, circling the cabin in a careful, deliberate pattern. None led away. They simply went around, over and over, like someone had been walking there all night, keeping the cabin at the center of their path. I gripped the rifle I had leaned against the wall, my fingers trembling around the cold wood. Every instinct screamed to call out, to run, to do anything, but I felt rooted to the spot, staring at the prints. For a moment, I imagined it was just a trick of the wind, or a lone fox caught in the storm. But no animal walked in such measured, overlapping patterns. I forced myself to open the door and step outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots, cold biting through my socks, the rifle shaking in my hands. The voices stopped the moment I stepped into the open. Absolute silence pressed down from the sky. The wind had dropped to a quiet whistle, and the snow around me looked untouched, as if no one had been there at all. I moved toward the prints, tracing them with the tip of my boot, but they were gone, vanished, leaving nothing but fresh snow where the paths had been. My breath came in ragged clouds, and I looked around, half expecting someone, or something, to step out from between the trees. There was nothing. Just the hush of the forest, the slow, steady fall of snow, and the echo of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. That night I stayed awake by the fire, rifle close, watching the windows, listening to the wind whisper and howl. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts, each time waking to that same sensation, the presence of someone outside, circling, waiting. I dared not look, afraid to confirm what my mind had already suggested. The cabin, once a refuge, had become a trap, a quiet center of something I could not name. The wind pressed against the logs as if testing the barriers, and every shadow in the room seemed to lean closer when I looked at it directly. Morning arrived in pale shades of grey. Snow stretched like a blank canvas under the weak sun, and I half expected to find more traces of those visitors. Instead, there was only one new anomaly, a single line of wet bootprints leading from the door into the living room, stopping right at my chair where I had spent the night watching and listening. I couldn't explain it. My hands shook as I followed the prints, rifle in hand, but they ended at the chair. Nothing more. No footprints leading back outside, no other marks anywhere. It was as if someone had walked straight through the cabin and disappeared into the air. The thought of it made my stomach churn. I searched every corner, every shadowed hallway, but found nothing. Only the footprints and the heavy, lingering sense of being watched. Over the next day, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it had been a hiker lost in the storm, seeking warmth, but the prints made no sense. The looping patterns, the disappearance, the solitary path into the room without leaving again. And the voices, soft and deliberate, had continued in my memory even when the cabin was silent. At night, I would hear them again, though now more distant, as if they lingered in the walls themselves, following the rhythm of my own pulse. I couldn't stay outside, couldn't bear to sleep in the open, and I couldn't leave entirely, trapped by the snowstorm and the forest's endless white. By the third day, the presence felt tangible. Almost a weight pressing down on the cabin. The air grew cold in patches, the kind of cold that burns your lungs when you breathe, and I would sometimes see movement just beyond the windows, a shadow shifting against the snow, quick enough that I'd blink and it would vanish, slow enough to make my pulse pound in the silence that followed. My mind began to blur the line between reality and imagination. Every snapping branch, every gust of wind sounded like deliberate steps, calculated pacing, echoing that first night. I could not shake the sense that someone, or something, was not only outside, but inside, aware of my presence, adjusting its behavior based on mine. When the storm finally broke, I left the cabin in a hurry, gathering my gear and stepping out into the crisp, sunlit forest. Yet even as I descended the ridge and reached the distant road, I could feel the eyes on me, lingering behind the snowbanks, pressed close to the cabin, waiting for my retreat. The footprints had vanished entirely when I returned weeks later with my cousin, but the sensation did not leave. I would sometimes dream of the line of wet prints leading from the door to where I had sat, and hear the murmured conversation, soft and indistinct, as if carried on the wind through miles of pines. Even now, when snow presses thick across the Appalachians, I think of that cabin, of the unseen guests circling, and the way they came close enough to touch without ever revealing themselves, leaving only their steps and the dread they carried. It is not a memory I can dismiss, nor a fear I can escape, and the thought of returning there, alone at night when the forest whispers, leaves a cold ache in my chest, a reminder that some presences are patient and some winters never truly end. Story 4. The Visitor at Dawn. The cabin I rented was the perfect spot for what I thought would be a quiet photography project. Nestled deep in the Appalachians, far from roads and neighbors, it sat on a small clearing surrounded by dense pines, the kind of trees that seemed to close in when the light was low. Each morning I woke before sunrise, dragging myself from the thin mattress to the window, eager to catch the fog rolling through the forest like a living thing, curling around trunks and snaking across the ground. The air was sharp, sweet with the scent of damp earth and moss, and the only sounds were the occasional crow or the distant scrape of branches against each other. At first, it felt like solitude in its purest form, a place to breathe, to create, to be unseen. By the fourth morning, something changed. I was outside, camera poised, waiting for the fog to thicken, when I caught a figure just beyond the tree line. He was standing perfectly still, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, shoulders square, body rigid. My heart skipped. I raised the camera and snapped a photo, the click startling in the morning hush. When I lowered it and blinked against the early light, he was gone. The space where he had stood was empty, and only the mist moved with the breeze. I told myself I had imagined it, a trick of shadow and fog, but the unease lingered, crawling along my spine as I packed up my gear for breakfast. The next morning, the same figure appeared. This time he was closer, about halfway between the forest and the cabin's porch, still silent, still unmoving. I tried to move faster, to focus the lens, but no matter how I adjusted or blinked, he never seemed to shift, never seemed to take a step. I could feel the weight of his gaze even through the mist, though I could not see his face beneath the brim of the hat. My stomach knotted. I spent the rest of the day checking the perimeter, circling the cabin, but found no footprints, no sign of passage through the snow-matted grass or the damp soil. Nothing. It was as if he existed only in the early light, dissolving the moment I tried to confront him. By the 5th and 6th mornings, the pattern continued. He was always closer, always at the edge of the clearing, just far enough that I could not fully make out his features, yet near enough that the sense of being watched became almost physical. Each time I raised the camera, the act of observing seemed to shift him, though I never saw him move. He was just there, closer than before, waiting in silence. Sleep became uneasy. I would wake in the middle of the night, convinced I had glimpsed him in the dark, a shadow among the pines. Each time I told myself it was a trick of exhaustion, a projection of my mind into the mist, yet the dread was real, settling in my chest like a stone. On the 7th morning, I woke before dawn, heart thudding, breath tight. When I drew back the curtain, he was standing directly outside the window, hat brim casting a shadow over his face. I froze, camera in hand, unable to move, unable to speak. The fog curled lazily around his feet, the chill air pressing in, smelling faintly of wet pine and soil. My instinct was to call out, to run, but my body refused, as if frozen by the weight of his presence. For a long moment, I watched him, memorizing the stillness, the impossibility of it. Then, as the first thin rays of sun began to brighten the treetops, I did the only thing I could think of. I packed in silence, slipping out before he could vanish or react, leaving behind my equipment, my food, and the quiet fear that had lodged itself deep in my chest. Even now, weeks later, I cannot shake the memory. I replay the mornings in my mind, the way he appeared closer each day without ever moving, the way the mist seemed to shift around him as if bending to his presence. I cannot explain it. There are no tracks, no sign he ever entered the clearing. But I remember the weight of his gaze, the stillness that pressed on me more than the cold ever could. I left that cabin and never returned. Yet I can feel him sometimes when I walk through forests, a presence just beyond the tree line, silent, waiting, patient, reminding me that solitude in the mountains is never as simple as it seems, and that some watchers exist only for those willing or forced to see them. Story 5. The Cry from the Basement. The cabin had been cheap, more than cheap, practically abandoned on the edge of the forest. Windows grimy and warped from years of neglect, siding cracked, shingles curling like burnt paper. The owner had warned me once, casual, almost joking, that the basement was off limits, that it wasn't safe and I shouldn't go down there. I nodded, said nothing, but the restriction didn't bother me at first. I had no intention of exploring it. I was there to sketch, to photograph, to breathe in the quiet that only these remote Appalachian woods could offer. The first night, I settled into the living room with a small lantern, the fire dying low in the hearth. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, a soft whisper that pressed against the walls. That was when I heard it, a faint crying from somewhere below, muffled, almost tentative. I froze. At first I told myself it was the wind through the crawlspace, or perhaps a raccoon trapped somewhere in the eaves, something natural, something explainable. By the second night, the crying had grown slightly clearer. I could make out the uneven cadence, the irregular pauses that suggested a living, breathing presence. It sounded like a child, small and terrified, sobbing through thick wood and stone. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to ignore it, staying near the fire, reading, writing, trying to convince myself that the forest was playing tricks on my ears. But curiosity began to gnaw at me, soft at first, then louder, until I found myself standing before the basement door, pressing my ear to its cold, rough surface. That's when it hit me. The breaths, shaky and uneven, choked with something I couldn't place. There were words, too, whispered and unintelligible, like someone trying to speak but not finding the language. My skin prickled. I stepped back and tried to rationalize it. The cabin was old. The wind moved in strange ways through old boards. Yet my rational mind didn't ease the tight knot of dread that had settled in my stomach. The third night, I couldn't stand it anymore. I went to the tool shed outside and returned with a crowbar, heart hammering, palms slick with sweat. The night was quiet, the air cold and heavy, the moon slipping in and out of cloud cover. I approached the basement door with hesitant steps, each creak of the floor echoing unnaturally in the stillness. I wedged the crowbar into the frame, prying slowly, testing the old wood. But the moment the door shifted even an inch, the crying stopped. Absolute silence pressed down, thicker than any snow-laden air. My pulse thundered in my ears. I froze, gripping the crowbar as if it were a lifeline. And then it came. A single knock, slow, deliberate from the other side of the door. My breath caught. I stepped back, trying to steady my shaking hands. There was no logic here, none I could grasp. The door was locked from within. The basement uninviting and forbidden. Yet it had made its presence known in the most intimate, almost intimate way. Sound. And now that sound had become deliberate, purposeful, as if someone, or something, had been waiting, listening, testing me as much as I had been testing it. I remember standing there, the dim light from the lantern casting long shadows along the floorboards, feeling a chill that went deeper than the winter air outside. I wanted to run, but my feet stayed planted. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but my throat tightened. All night I sat near the door, listening. Any movement in the house sounded amplified, the settling wood, the groan of the cabin against the wind, even the faint scratch of an animal outside. All of it seemed magnified, all of it a potential echo of what waited behind that door. Sleep was impossible. When dawn finally came, grey and muted, I crept to the kitchen, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the entire thing, that perhaps it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the memory of the knock stayed, slow and deliberate, carved into my brain with a precision that made me flinch every time I remembered it. I never opened that basement door. The cabin sat quietly after that, its silence heavier than before, as if the act of trying to intrude had changed something, awakened a presence I didn't understand. Every sound in the following days, the creak of the roof, the sigh of the wind, even the faint thump of a falling branch, felt weighted, charged with unseen attention. I would catch myself glancing toward the basement door, heart tightening, wondering if the crying had resumed in my absence, or if it had been waiting for me to return, patiently, deliberately. When I left the cabin at the end of the week, I tried to shake the experience from my mind, to convince myself it was a trick of exhaustion, the imagination stretched too thin by solitude. But the image of that basement door, the sound of the sobbing that might have been real, the single knock that was so deliberate and knowing, it followed me, uninvited, into my dreams. I could hear it in the quiet moments, faint and distant, echoing through rooms where no one else was, reminding me of a presence that would not be denied, that would not be ignored. Even now, years later, I can't bring myself to step into old cabins without considering the spaces beneath them, the rooms locked, the doors off limits. I can still hear it sometimes, faint, behind walls, beneath floors, a voice too human to be a trick of the mind, too strange to be natural. The memory of that knock, so deliberate, lingers as if etched into my very perception of solitude and isolation. I've told myself countless times that it was just an old building, that the wind and shadows created illusions. But deep down, I know that some doors are meant to remain closed, some cries are meant to echo unheard, and some presences wait in the dark, patient, aware, and entirely indifferent to our need for explanation. Story 6. The Cabin That Wasn't There. Yesterday I set out that spring morning like I always do, boots crunching over moss-covered boulders and fallen branches, the ridge still damp from last night's rain. The forest was waking up slowly, birds calling across the valleys, the smell of wet pine and earth filling the air. I'd hiked this trail every year for more than a decade, watching the same patches of sunlight move across the rocks, the same wind-rubbed trees standing sentinel along the ridge. There had never been anything there beyond trees, rocks, and the occasional patch of wildflowers clinging to the slopes. And yet, that morning, as I rounded a bend near a familiar mossy clearing, I saw it. A cabin, impossibly new. Sitting in the center of the open space, smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. I stopped dead, the smell of burning wood reaching me even before I took in the sight. The cabin looked immaculate, wood unstained by age, no lichen, no moss on the roof, windows that gleamed in the soft morning light. I stepped closer, heart pounding, circling the structure slowly, taking in the details. There was no path, no indication of how it could have appeared overnight. I knocked on the door, called out, even circled back around the other side, checking for any sign of life. Nothing. No reply, no movement, only the gentle hiss of smoke and the whisper of wind through the trees. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to treat it like some strange mirage, but curiosity was a stronger pull than fear. I opened the door. Warmth hit me immediately, the kind that seeps into your chest and makes you pause, disarming in its comfort. The fire in the hearth crackled faintly, wood smouldering with an almost deliberate rhythm. There was no dust, no cobwebs, no sign of neglect. Just a clean, empty space, except for one thing, a table carved from dark wood, perfectly polished, with a single leather-bound journal resting on it. I stepped closer, hesitant, almost afraid to touch it, but I had to. The leather was soft under my fingers, warm almost, as if it had been waiting for me. Opening the journal, the first thing that struck me was the dates. They were all in the future, years from now, and yet the handwriting was eerily familiar. My own handwriting, in my own style. I flipped through the pages, scanning the entries, and felt my stomach tighten. Each one described in precise detail the path I had taken that morning, the exact trees I passed, the rocks I climbed, the faintly mossy areas I had paused to photograph. The descriptions were intimate, unnervingly so, chronicling moments only I could have known, down to the way my boots pressed into the wet earth. And then I turned to a page dated for later that very day. My pulse surged as I read the words. It described my approach to the clearing, the first sight of the cabin, the circling of the structure, my hesitation at the door. Every action I had taken, every thought that had flitted through my mind that morning, was written there in precise detail. The last line was written in the present tense, chilling in its immediacy. I pick up the journal, hands shaking, and realize that this is the moment everything begins. I slammed the journal shut, the sound deafening in the otherwise quiet cabin. My pulse raced, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to abandon this impossible structure and forget I had ever seen it. But the warmth of the fire, the surreal clarity of the cabin, and the knowledge that the journal had been waiting for me made me pause. I circled the room again, looking for signs of anything else, but there was nothing. No footprints leading to the door, no extra chairs, no notes, just the table, the journal, and the quiet crackle of fire that seemed almost too deliberate. I spent what felt like hours inside, half expecting someone or something to appear, to claim the cabin as its own, to explain the impossibility of it. Outside, the ridge remained unchanged, untouched, except for the clearing now hosting this impossible structure. The journal stayed on the table, open to the page describing my arrival, and I couldn't bring myself to write, to leave a mark, to alter what had already been inscribed. The forest pressed in around the cabin, wind whispering through the pines as if carrying secrets I was too afraid to understand. By mid-morning, I forced myself to step outside, glancing back over my shoulder. The smoke still curled from the chimney. Though no one had come, no one had left. I circled the cabin, inspecting every log, every corner, half expecting to find some clue, footprints, tools, an abandoned pack, but there was nothing, no disturbance in the moss, no path leading to or from the clearing. The cabin had appeared from nowhere, perfectly formed, waiting silently for me. When I returned inside, I noticed the journal had shifted slightly, lying open to a page I hadn't turned to. My hands shook as I reached for it, reading lines that described my own thoughts, the fear curling in my stomach, the way I had traced my fingers over the table, the firelight catching the edge of the leather. It was as though the cabin knew me, understood me, anticipated every movement, every choice. The sense of being watched, or perhaps chronicled, was overwhelming. I felt like a character in a story already written, unable to change the narrative even as it unfolded around me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed distorted in the presence of the cabin. I wanted to leave, but a strange inertia kept me rooted. The journal's pages seemed to shift subtly as I glanced away, entries updating with a clarity that matched my current thoughts. It was no longer just a record, it was a map of my mind, an echo of my intentions, a mirror of my deepest curiosities and fears. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the cabin itself had somehow read me before I had entered, as if every secret I held had been laid bare on those leather pages. Eventually, I forced myself to step outside again, heart hammering. I wandered through the clearing, looking at the surrounding trees, the moss-covered boulders I knew so well. The forest was unchanged, familiar, yet subtly altered by the presence of the cabin. I could feel the eyes of the structure on me, the awareness that I was part of something I could neither fully understand nor escape. Even as I descended the ridge, leaving the impossible cabin behind, the image of it burned into my mind. I could see the smoke, feel the warmth, hear the subtle creak of the floorboards, and sense the journal waiting silently, recording everything I had done, everything I had thought. Weeks later, I returned to that ridge, hoping it had been a hallucination, a trick of sunlight and fog, but the clearing was empty again. Moss had begun to creep over the spot where the cabin had stood, as if the earth itself was trying to erase the impossibility. No sign of footprints, no trace of smoke, no evidence that anyone or anything had ever been there. I knew the cabin had not moved, that it had not gone anywhere. It had never been meant to stay, and yet I could still feel it, a weight in my memory, a presence in the shadows of my mind, waiting for the next hike, for the next observer to stumble upon its impossible existence. The journal, its pages written in a hand identical to my own, haunted me. I thought about it every time I walked through familiar woods, every time I returned to ridges I had hiked for years. The memory of opening it, the certainty that it knew me, that it predicted me, left a cold ache in my chest. I wondered if I would ever see it again, or if the ridge would remain empty, hiding the cabin as a secret between me and the forest. The thought alone carried a weight of dread, the knowledge that some things exist just beyond our comprehension, waiting, patient, and utterly indifferent to our understanding. Even now when spring comes and I hike familiar paths, I cannot stop myself from glancing at every clearing, every ridge, wondering if the cabin has returned, if smoke curls once more from a hidden chimney, if a table waits with a journal open to my name. The forest remains unchanged, yet the memory of that impossible morning lingers, and I know I will never hike that ridge the same way again, never see those moss-covered boulders as simply rocks, and never walk into a clearing without the unsettling suspicion that the world is capable of more than I can imagine. Story 7. The Last Photo. I remember the cabin like it was a relic frozen in time, abandoned and sagging in the clearing where the forest pressed in too close. My friend and I had gone up there for the weekend to clean it out, an old family property nobody used, full of dust, cobwebs, and the thick musty smell of wood left to rot. The kind of place where the floors creak under every step, and the wind whistles through gaps in the walls like the breath of some distant, patient animal. It had been empty for decades, or at least that's what the papers and our research suggested, yet there was an energy to the place, heavy and silent, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up as soon as we stepped inside. We were rummaging through drawers and cabinets when we found it, a small old camera tucked in the back of a kitchen drawer, dusty and worn, a roll of film still inside. The canister had only one photo left, according to the counter on the camera, and my friend, laughing nervously, suggested we take a picture for fun. I wasn't particularly inclined to, but something about the camera felt magnetic. I followed along anyway. We set it up on a chair near the fireplace, framing ourselves as best we could, laughing at how ridiculous we looked in the dim, cold light of the cabin, and then we stepped into position and triggered the timer. The click echoed through the hollow room, startling a flock of birds outside that had been roosting nearby. And we forgot about it almost immediately. The days after that weekend were uneventful. Life outside the cabin resumed with its usual dull rhythm, but a few weeks later, I finally got the role developed. I wasn't expecting much, just a faint memory preserved in grainy black and white. But the moment I saw the images, my stomach dropped. The first few frames were normal. Dusty cabinets, the peeling paint, the fireplace, the shadowed corners of the room. Then came the last frame. I held it up, squinting. It wasn't the photo we had taken. It wasn't the laughable staged image of us smiling by the fireplace. It was the room itself, but seen from the outside, through the cabin window. I didn't notice it immediately, because at first, it looked like just a regular exterior shot. Then I saw us. We were there in the frame, standing by the fire exactly as we had posed weeks before, smiling, frozen in the captured moment. But behind us, a figure leaned forward from the shadows. A man, or something shaped like one, pressed between us, head cocked slightly, grinning. Not a friendly grin, not a human smile. Every tooth was visible, unnaturally white in the dim light of the photo, stretching too far across a face that I couldn't fully see. My fingers trembled. I traced the figure in disbelief, looking from the photograph to my friend across the kitchen table, trying to find some rational explanation. We hadn't noticed anyone in the cabin. The windows had been clear, the doors locked, and even the forest outside had been empty. I remembered every step we had taken, every creak and groan of the floorboards, every shadow that danced across the room from the fireplace's weak light. Nothing had seemed out of place. Yet there he was, or it was, leaning in between us, smiling wide enough to unnerve every instinct I had. My friend looked at me, pale, voice catching as he whispered, We were alone, right?" I nodded, trying to force confidence into my words, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been observed all along. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the photo on the bedside table, staring at it in the dim glow of my lamp. The figure seemed to shift slightly when I blinked, a trick of the grain. Perhaps, but the unease settled deep in my chest. I kept thinking about the cabin, about the way the air had felt thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves had been listening, recording our every move, storing it somewhere just out of sight. I told myself it was just a photograph, just shadows and light, the angles of a creaking floor and an overexposed roll of film, yet my instincts screamed otherwise. Over the next week, I found myself returning mentally to that cabin, picturing the interior exactly as it had been, imagining the figure in the corner, the grin that seemed to stretch wider every time I remembered it. I even tried to rationalize, to convince myself that perhaps the photo had been double exposed, some accident of the camera, but every technical explanation fell flat against the certainty in my gut. I had seen him, or it, there. And not just in the photo. I could feel its presence sometimes, in quiet moments, when I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. The awareness, the patience, the way it had waited until the photo captured it. I returned to the cabin a month later, partly out of morbid curiosity, partly because I couldn't stop thinking about that last frame. The forest had grown thicker, more suffocating, vines curling along the edges of the clearing, the moss reclaiming the wood. The cabin was still standing, exactly as I remembered, doors closed, windows intact. But the inside had changed. Dust had shifted as though something had moved through it. The fireplace which we had lit before was cold, but the shadows were longer, thicker, almost tangible. I felt my stomach knot. Every corner seemed to press in closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for our return, that it had never left, patient and deliberate. I didn't bring anyone back with me this time. I walked through the cabin slowly, retracing our previous movements, inspecting every shadowed corner, every crack in the walls. Nothing else was there, nothing alive at least, but the air hummed with anticipation. It felt alive, aware. And then I saw it, the window through which the final photo had been taken. Sunlight filtered through now. But the angle of the glass reflected the room perfectly, and for a moment I thought I could see a faint blur, like a human shape leaning forward just at the edge of perception. I blinked, and it was gone. My hands shook, and I realized I hadn't exhaled in several minutes. I left the cabin that day with a sense of profound unease. Weeks passed, but the photograph remained with me, always on my desk. A constant reminder that some things are patient, that some presences linger where they shouldn't, watching, waiting. I stopped hiking that trail, stopped returning to the clearing, yet sometimes in dreams I am back in that cabin, standing by the fireplace, smiling as I feel a breath across my neck. Hear the faint scrape of movement in the corner, and every time I wake, the photograph is there, unchanged, the figure still grinning, still pressed between us, reminding me that some images capture more than light and shadow. They capture attention, and some attention never lets go. Even now I cannot look at old cameras without imagining what might be left on the film, in the frames, waiting for me to return. I have a hard time trusting empty rooms, quiet clearings, abandoned spaces, because the memory of that cabin and the last photo lingers like a shadow in my mind, patient and aware. It is not a memory I can dismiss or a fear I can outrun. I sometimes think about returning just to see if he or it is still there. If it has been waiting all along for me to come back, but the thought of opening the door and seeing that grin again is enough to stop me. Even now I can feel it just behind my shoulder, in the periphery of thought, reminding me that some things follow, patiently, deliberately, until they have been seen fully, until they have been acknowledged. And even then, they might not leave. The photograph remains in its frame, a silent witness, And though I try to forget, I cannot. Every creak, every shadow in my home, every reflected shape in the corner of my eye makes me pause. The grin is there, frozen in the black and white, as wide and unnatural as the first moment I saw it. And the memory, the cabin, the last photo, they are all inseparable from one another, entwined in a story I did not ask to be part of but cannot escape. Sometimes, in the dead hours of the night, I imagine standing there again, the fire flickering, my friend beside me, and that figure looming behind, patient and unblinking. And I realize then that some images do more than preserve moments. They preserve the watcher who waits grinning until it has been acknowledged. Story 1, The Lantern in the Window. By the time the rain started, I was already too far along the ridge to turn back. It came in sheets, soaking through my jacket until the fabric clung cold against my skin. The trail turned to slick mud, and every step felt like I was sliding more than walking. I told myself I'd make it to the next bend, then find a dry patch under some pines to wait it out. But the fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen, curling low between the trees, swallowing up the trail behind me. That's when I noticed it. An orange glow through the mist, faint at first, then stronger, steady, like the promise of warmth in a place where nothing should be. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Its roof sagged in the middle, shingles missing in patches. Moss climbed halfway up the walls, and the steps sagged when I set my weight on them. Still, that single lantern in the window burned with an oddly clean light, no flicker, no wavering in the rain. I knocked once, then twice, calling out. My voice felt small out there, muffled by the weather. No answer. I told myself maybe someone had left it burning for a reason. Hunters, hikers, whoever. I pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, damp, tinged with something faintly metallic, like old pennies left too long in your hand. The place was stripped bare, no chairs, no table, no dishes. Just the lantern on the windowsill glowing from a bulb, not a flame. I frowned at the cord trailing from it, disappearing into the warped floorboards. There were no power lines for miles, no sign of a generator. I stood there, dripping onto the dusty floor, listening to the rain drumming the roof. That's when I heard it. Just the faintest shuffle from the far corner. I turned my head slowly. There was someone there. At first I thought it might have been a pile of rags or an old coat slumped over, but then it moved. Hunched low, shoulders narrow, head tilted just slightly as if listening. Their face was turned away from me, and I couldn't tell if they were sitting or crouching. My mouth went dry. I cleared my throat, tried to sound steady. "Hey," I said, no response. My heart was loud in my ears, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. The figure didn't turn, it didn't stand, it just reached out one hand, thin, pale, and placed it over the lantern. The light died instantly. The darkness inside that cabin was absolute. I couldn't see the walls, the floor, even my own hands. My first instinct was to step back toward the door, but in that blackness, my depth was gone. My boot caught on something, soft but solid, and I stumbled. I thought I heard breathing then, close, steady, unhurried. The smell of metal grew sharper. I reached out for the doorframe, but my fingers touched only air. I could feel the weight of the cabin pressing in as if the room itself had shrunk. I backed up, or at least I thought I was backing up, until my spine met wood, cold, rough. I slid my hand along it, trying to find the edge, the way out. Then there was the sound of something dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate, as though it was coming closer but didn't need to hurry. My breath felt too loud. I tried to speak again, to say I didn't mean to intrude, but the words came out as a whisper. My throat was dry. Somewhere in front of me a faint click echoed like a light switch. But no light came. I froze. Then I heard a second sound, a deep creak, like the floor bowing under someone's weight. My instinct screamed at me to move. I found the edge of the wall and turned sharply, pushing forward until my palms hit the wet wood of the door. My hands scrambled over it in the dark until I found the handle and wrenched it open. Rain and pale grey fog poured in. I didn't look back. I ran down the steps and into the trees, the mud sucking at my boots, branches clawing at my arms. I didn't stop until I could no longer see any trace of that orange light through the fog. When I finally slowed, bent over and gasping, I turned to get my bearings. The ridge behind me was empty, just pines and mist. No cabin, no glow. I kept walking until I reached the trailhead, long after the rain had stopped. My truck was there, just as I'd left it, the sun breaking faintly through the clouds. But when I pulled the door open, there was something on the passenger seat, a lantern, same shape, same handle. The cord was missing, but the bulb inside was still glowing.